What the great figures involved in the 16th and 17th century blossoming of science did confess was their absolute faith in a creator God, whose work incorporated rational rules awaiting discovery. The rise of science was not an extension of classical learning, it was the natural outgrowth of Christian doctrine. Nature exists because it was created by God. In order to love and honor God, it is necessary to fully appreciate the wonders of His handiwork. Because God is perfect, His handiwork functions in accord with immutable principles. By the full use of our God-given powers of reason and observation, it ought to be possible to discover these principles. These were the crucial ideas that explain why science arose in Christian Europe and nowhere else. Moral innovations. The blessings of a theology of reason were not confined to the sciences. From its earliest days, Christianity was equally inventive in its conceptions of human nature and in confronting issues of morality. Chief among these were propositions concerning fundamental human rights, such as liberty and freedom, and underlying these ideas was something even more basic, the discovery of individualism, of the self. The notion that individualism was discovered seems absurd to the modern mind, and to some extent it is. All normal humans know themselves as separate creatures who necessarily look out upon the world from a unique point of vision and whose nerve endings are absolutely singular. Nevertheless, some cultures emphasize feelings of separate individuality, while others stress collectivity and suppress the sense of self. In the latter kind of culture, which seems to be in the great majority, a person's real sense of being is quite collective. Whatever rights individuals possess are accorded not to them, but to their group, and are in turn conferred upon them by their group. In such circumstances, no one supposes that I am the master of my fate. Instead, it is the idea of fatalism that rings true, that one's fate is beyond one's control, being fully determined by great external forces. Even the Greek philosophers had no concept quite equivalent to our notion of the person. Thus, when Plato was writing the Republic, his focus was on the polis, on the city, not on its citizens. Indeed, he even denounced private property. In contrast, it is the individual citizen who was the focus of Christian political thought, and this in turn explicitly shaped the views of later European political philosophers such as Hobbes and Locke. This was quite literally revolutionary stuff, for the Christian stress on individualism is an eccentricity among cultures. Freedom is another concept that simply doesn't exist in many, perhaps most, human cultures. There isn't even a word for freedom in most non-European languages. No wonder that all of the more advanced of these cultures embraced slavery and sustained despotic states wherein the phrase individual human rights would have been incomprehensible. So long as that was true, the freedom essential to the rise of capitalism was lacking. Therefore, to account for the emergence of freedom and the rise of capitalism in Europe, it is necessary first to understand how and when Europeans developed and accepted notions such as individualism, freedom, and human rights. The rise of individualism. Compare Shakespeare's tragedies with those of the ancient Greeks. As Colin Morris pointed out, Oedipus did nothing to earn his sad end. His personal character is really irrelevant to his misfortunes, which were decreed by fate irrespective of his own desires. Not that Oedipus was without faults, but his crime lacked any guilty intent. He simply fell victim to his destiny. In contrast, Othello, Brutus, and the Macbeths were not captives of blind fate. As Cassius pointed out to Brutus, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Much has been written about the origins of individualism. All of these books and articles are learned and even excessively literate, but they also are surprisingly vague and elusive, perhaps because of a reluctance to express their fundamental thesis too openly, that the Western sense of individualism was largely a Christian creation. From the beginning, Christianity has taught that sin is a personal matter, that it does not inhere primarily in the group, but each individual must be concerned with her or his personal salvation. Perhaps nothing is of greater significance to the Christian emphasis on individualism than the doctrine of free will. If, as Shakespeare wrote, the fault is in ourselves, it is because we believe we have the opportunity to choose and the responsibility to choose well. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, whose gods were remarkably lacking in virtues and did not concern themselves with human misbehavior, other than failures to propitiate them in an appropriate manner, the Christian God is a judge who rewards virtue and punishes sin. This conception of God is incompatible with fatalism. To suggest otherwise is to blame one's sins upon God, to hold that God not only punishes sins but causes them to occur. Such a view is inconsistent with the entire Christian outlook. The admonition, "Go and sin no more," is absurd if we're merely captives of our fate. Rather, Christianity was founded on the doctrine that humans have been given the capacity, and hence the responsibility, to determine their own actions. St. Augustine wrote again and again that we possess a will, and that from this it follows that whoever desires to live righteously and honorably can accomplish this. Nor is this view inconsistent with the doctrine that God knows ahead of time what choices we will make. Writing in refutation of Greek and Roman philosophers, Augustine asserted both that God knows all things before they come to pass, and that we do by our free will whatsoever we know and feel to be done by us only because we will it. But that all things come from fate we do not say, nay, we affirm that nothing comes to pass by fate. While God knows what we will freely decide to do, he does not interfere. Therefore it remains up to us to choose virtue or sin. Augustine's views were echoed across generations of Christian thought. Thomas Aquinas reaffirmed Augustine when he taught that the doctrines that humans are free to make moral choices and that God is omnipotent are entirely compatible. A man can direct and govern his own actions also. Therefore the rational creature participates in the divine providence not only in being governed but also in governing. Indeed, Augustine fully anticipated Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" in many passages, including this one. But without any delusive representation of images or phantasms, I am most certain that I am, and that I know and delight in this. In respect to these truths, I am not at all afraid of the arguments of the academicians who say, "What if you are deceived? For if I am deceived, I am. For he who is not cannot be deceived. And if I am deceived, by the same token I am. And consequently, neither am I deceived in knowing that I know. For as I know that I am, so I know this also, that I know." The idea of free will did not originate with Christians. Cicero expressed views somewhat similar to Augustine's, but for them it was not an obscure philosophical matter. Rather, it was the fundamental principle of their faith. Thus, while ordinary Greek or Roman pagans embraced fatalism, whatever reservations about it some ancient philosophers might have expressed, Jesus taught that each individual must atone for moral lapses precisely because these are wrong choices. There could be no more compelling intellectual emphasis on self and individuality than this. The abolition of medieval slavery. The rise of individualism not only prompted self-examination, but raised questions concerning the boundaries of personal freedom. If we are unique beings, all to be judged by our actions freely taken, what is the duty of Christians with regard to another's freedom to act? As the Church Fathers pondered the implications of free will, and especially after the fall of Rome, they grew increasingly uncomfortable with the institution of slavery. Unlike Asian languages, Greek and Latin have words for freedom, and many Greeks and Romans regarded themselves as free. But their freedom stood in contrast to a mass of slaves, for in classical times freedom was a privilege, not a right. Plato did oppose enslavement of his fellow Hellenes, Greeks, but assigned barbarian foreign slaves a vital role in his ideal republic. They would perform all of the productive labor. In fact, the rules Plato laid out concerning the proper treatment of slaves were unusually brutal, for he believed not that becoming a slave was simply a matter of bad luck, but that nature creates a slavish people lacking the mental capacity for virtue or culture and fit only to serve. Plato did suggest that although slaves should be sternly disciplined in order to prevent needless unrest, they generally should not be subject to excessive cruelty. As enumerated in his will, Plato's estate included 5 slaves. As for Aristotle, he rejected the position advanced by the sophists that all authority rests on force and therefore is self-justifying because he sought to condemn political tyranny. But then, how to justify slavery? Without slaves to do the labor, Aristotle argued, enlightened men would lack the time and energy to pursue virtue and wisdom. He also drew upon Plato's biological claims. Slavery is justified because slaves are more akin to dumb brutes than to free men. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Upon his death, Aristotle's personal property included 14 slaves. Slavery began to decline in the latter days of the Roman Empire as a direct result of military weakness. No longer were victorious commanders dispatching throngs of prisoners to the slave markets. Since fertility was very low among Roman slaves, due both to privation and to a lack of women, their numbers rapidly fell, and the shortage of slaves soon caused the conversion of agriculture and industry to reliance on free laborers. After the fall of Rome, with the successful military expeditions of the new Germanic kingdoms, slavery regained a major role in production. Though no one really knows how many slaves there were in Europe during, say, the 6th century, they seem to have been plentiful, and their treatment was, if anything, harsher than in classical times. In the legal codes of the various Germanic groups that ruled in place of Roman governors, slaves were equated not with other humans, but specifically with animal livestock. Nevertheless, several centuries later, slavery was on the way out. Some historians deny that there ever was an end to medieval slavery, that nothing happened other than a linguistic shift in which the word slave was replaced by the word serf. Here it is not history but historians who are playing word games. Serfs were not chattels. They had rights and a substantial degree of discretion. They married whom they wished, and their families were not subject to sale or dispersal. They paid rent and thus controlled their own time and the pace of their work. If, as in some places, serfs owed their lords a number of days of labor each year, the obligation was limited and more similar to hired labor than to slavery. Although serfs were bound to a lord by extensive obligations, so too was their lord bound by obligations to them as well as to a higher authority, and so on up the line, for sets of mutual obligations were the fundamental nature of feudalism. While no one would argue that medieval peasants were free in the modern sense, they were not slaves, and that brutal institution had essentially disappeared from Europe by the end of the 10th century. Although most recent historians agree with that conclusion, it remains fashionable to deny that Christianity had anything to do with it. As Robert Fossier put it, the progressive elimination of slavery was in no way the work of Christian peoples. The Church preached resignation, promised equality in the hereafter, and felt no compunction about keeping large herds of animals with human faces. Georges Duby also dismissed any role of the Church in ending slavery. Christianity did not condemn slavery, it dealt it barely a glancing blow. Rather, slavery is said to have disappeared because it became an unprofitable and outdated mode of production. Even Robert Lopez accepted this view, claiming that slavery ended only when technological progress, such as the water wheel, made slaves useless or unproductive. Hence the claim that the end of slavery was not a moral decision, but one of pure self-interest on the part of the elite. That same argument has been made concerning the abolition of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Both claims are consistent, of course, with Marxist doctrine, but are quite inconsistent with economic realities. Even as late as the start of the American Civil War, Southern slavery remained a very profitable mode of production. The same was true in early medieval Europe. But enough. Slavery ended in medieval Europe only because the Church extended its sacraments to all slaves and then managed to impose a ban on the enslavement of Christians and of Jews. Within the context of medieval Europe, that prohibition was effectively a rule of universal abolition. In the beginning, the Church asserted the legitimacy of slavery, but did so with a certain ambiguity. Consider the most cited New Testament passage on slavery. Writing to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 5 and 8, Paul admonished, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters, in fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as to Christ, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same again from the Lord, whether he is slave or free." Those who eagerly quote this passage very seldom go on to quote the next verse. "Masters, do the same to them and forbear threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." That God treats all equally is fundamental to the Christian message. All may be saved. It was this that encouraged the early church to convert slaves and, when possible, to purchase their freedom. Pope Callistus, died 236, had himself been a slave. So long as the Roman Empire stood, the Church continued to affirm the legitimacy of slavery. In 324, the Christian Council of Granges condemned anyone who encouraged discontent among slaves, which suggests, of course, that such activities were taking place. However, the tension between support for slavery and emphasis on the equality of all in the eyes of God continued to grow, and with the demise of the empire, the strain grew ever more intense because the Church continued to extend its embrace to those in slavery, denying them only ordination into the priesthood. Pierre Bonossi has expressed the matter as well as anyone. A slave was baptized and had a soul. He was then unambiguously a man. With slaves fully recognized as human and Christian, priests began to urge owners to free their slaves as an infinitely commendable act that helped ensure their own salvation. Many manumissions were recorded in surviving wills. The doctrine that slaves were humans and not cattle had another important consequence: intermarriage. Despite their being against the law in most of Europe, there is considerable evidence of mixed unions by the 7th century, usually involving free men and female slaves. The most celebrated of these unions took place in 649, when Clovis II, king of the Franks, married his British slave Bathilda. When Clovis died in 657, Bathilda ruled as regent until her eldest son came of age. Bathilda used her position to mount a campaign to halt the slave trade and to redeem those in slavery. Upon her death, the Church acknowledged Bathilda as a saint. At the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne opposed slavery, while the Pope and many other powerful and effective clerical voices echoed Saint Bathilda. As the 9th century dawned, Bishop Agobard of Lyon thundered, All men are brothers, all invoke one same Father, God, the slave and the master, the poor man and the rich man, the ignorant and the learned, the weak and the strong. None has been raised above the other. There is no slave or free, but in all things and always there is only Christ. At the same time, Abbot Smaragda of San Miel wrote in a work dedicated to Charlemagne, "Most merciful king, forbid that there should be any slave in your kingdom." Soon no one doubted that slavery in itself was against divine law. Indeed, during the 11th century, both St. Wulfstan and St. Anselm campaigned to remove the last vestiges of slavery in Christendom, and soon it could be said that no man, no real Christian at any rate, could thereafter legitimately be held as the property of another. But exceptions remained, all of them involving extensive interaction with Islam. In Spain, Christian and Muslim armies continued to enslave each other's captives taken in battle, and slave trading involving northern Italian export firms and Muslim buyers persisted into the 15th century in defiance of the Church. The number of slaves involved in this trade was small. They were purchased from Slavic tribes in the Caucasus. The word slave is a corruption of the word Slav. A few were kept as a form of luxury goods by very wealthy Italians such as the Medici, but most were exported to Islam, white slaves being more precious than gold in trading with Egypt. This residual slave trade was periodically condemned by local clergy and slowly withered away, only to reappear with a vengeance in the New World. The Church responded vigorously, and a series of angry bulls against New World slavery were issued by 16th century popes, but the popes had no serious temporal power in this era, and their vigorous opposition was to no avail. The theoretical conclusion that slavery is sinful has been unique to Christianity, although several early Jewish sects also rejected slavery. Here, too, can be seen the principle of theological progress at work, making it possible for theologians to propose new interpretations without engendering charges of heresy. As noted, the other major religions are strongly oriented to the past and to the principle that, if anything, history is regressive and later generations are prone to error. Therefore, to say that the sages or saints in times past may have had an imperfect or limited understanding of religious truths is rejected out of hand by Buddhists, Confucianists, Hindus, and even by Muslims. While Christian theologians could plausibly correct St. Paul's understanding of God's will concerning slavery, such corrections were and are essentially precluded in other faiths, except as heresies. A second factor is that, of the major world faiths, only Christianity has devoted serious and sustained attention to human rights, as opposed to human duties. Put another way, the other great faiths minimize individualism and stress collective obligations. They are, as Ruth Benedict so aptly put it, cultures of shame rather than cultures of guilt. Keep in mind that there is not even a word for freedom in the languages in which their scriptures are written, including Hebrew. As for Islam, there is a uniquely insuperable barrier to theological condemnations of slavery. Muhammad bought, sold, captured, and owned slaves. The Prophet did advise that slaves should be treated well. Feed them what you eat yourself, and clothe them with what you wear. They are God's people like unto you, and be kind unto them. Muhammad also freed several of his slaves, adopted one as his son, and married another. In addition, the Quran teaches that it is wrong to compel your slave girls to prostitution, chapter 24, verse 33, and that no one can gain forgiveness for killing a fellow believer by freeing a slave, chapter 4, verse 92. Muhammad's admonition and example probably often mitigated the conditions of slaves in Islam, as contrasted with those in Greece and Rome. But the fundamental morality of the institution of slavery was not in doubt. While Christian theologians were able to work their way around the biblical acceptance of slavery, they probably could not have done so had Jesus kept slaves. That Muhammad owned slaves has presented Muslim theologians with a fact that no intellectual maneuvering could overcome, even had they desired to do so. If Western success rests upon victories of reason, then the rise of Christianity surely was the most important single event in European history. It was the Church that gave steadfast testimony to the power of reason and to the possibility of progress, to the guiding principle that one day we shall. And so, one day we did. Nor was the fulfillment of this promise long delayed by centuries of ignorance and superstition, as claimed by spurious tales about dark ages. Rapid intellectual and material progress began as soon as Europeans escaped from the stultifying grip of Roman repression and mistaken Greek idealism.